All right, so we ready to bring on our next guest?
Yes.
All right, so we have Sherri Smith and Elizabeth Gatlin. There we go.
Believe it or not, I'm still getting over this
Well,
sinus
don't feel
infection.
bad because my eye keeps watering. I don't want y'all thinking I'm crying. I mean, I love the interviews, but I'm I'm not crying.
I brought you to tears. So
So,
anyway, this is an aside. So our next two guests are co-authors of a book called American Wings, and we are still dealing with history and the military. So our first guest was military women, and this one is both this aviators, and it's for Chicago aviators from World War II as well. So
awesome.
welcome Sherri and Elizabeth to Black Authors Matter TV.
And you can go ahead and unmute, unless you're in the same place and you're going to have feedback.
No, and Elizabeth is joining us from London. Is that right? Or
Scotland.
Scotland. Okay. So welcome. What time is it there?
You don't want to know. It's 1:30.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for staying up all hours of the night.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much.
So how did you two come together to create this book? I mean, you're in totally different parts. Huh? Did I take your question, Gwen?
No, yeah. I mean, yeah, we do that often. But yes, that's exactly what I was going to ask.
So we knew about each other. We kind of both write the same thing. We write in the same genre. We don't write exactly the same thing, but we both write about young people flying, and we both write about World War II. And I got sent one of Sherri's books, her book, The Blossom and the Firefly, to write an endorsement for her, a blurb for her on the back. Okay. And I had just finished writing nonfiction book about women pilots in World War II. And I was thinking about the subject of this book. And I thought it will be so much easier if I have somebody to work with me. And I could tell from what I was reading of Sherri's book, and I knew her other work as well. And she'd written about the Tuskegee Airmen. She'd written Fly Girl, and I knew she could do research. And I thought, aha, okay, maybe she would like to join me on this project. And from Sherri's point of view, it was a little bit different.
Was definitely different from my point of view. So I wrote a book called Fly Girl, and when it came out, it's about a light-skinned Black girl who joins the Women's Air Force Service Pilots in World War II. And when it came out, every single person said, "Oh my God, have you read Codename Verity by Elizabeth Wein?" And they all talked about how great Elizabeth's book was. And so I had a little bit of a chip on my shoulder, I have to say, about it. And then when my editor was like, "Oh, we're gonna, Elizabeth Wein says she'll give you a blurb for The Blossom and the Firefly, but she wants to talk to you." I was like taking off my earrings. I'm like, okay, I'm finally gonna have it out with Elizabeth. And instead, she was like, "Do you
It's gonna be a fight to the death."
Totally, that's what I thought. And she's like, "Do you want to do a team up?" Because in Fly Girl, the main character wants to go to a flying school in Chicago run by Cornelius Coffey. And in my Tuskegee Airmen book, which is a nonfiction book, Who Were the Tuskegee Airmen, there's an aside about Coffey because he ran the flying school that ended up training a lot of the people who went on to train the Tuskegee Airmen. And Elizabeth had touched on similar history and was inspired by one of our book, American Wings, follows four people, John C. Robinson, Cornelius Coffey, Janet Harmon Bragg, and Willa Brown. And Elizabeth had touched on John Robinson's legacy. And so it suddenly just seemed like, and of course, you don't need, there's no knife fight in the back alley of book world here. This is like the perfect team up instead. And I gotta say, I'm delighted that she thought to ask.
Well, I was delighted that Sherri accepted. And really from the start, it was a collaboration because we had this idea. I said, would you like to do this? And we then had to come up with a pitch together. Sherri wrote the chapter outline that we sent out to different editors. It was, right from the very beginning, before we'd even written anything or done any of the research, we were both working on it.
It was really
So
exciting.
what's it like to be able to write together? I mean, I don't know if you have different writing styles or if you wrote a different, okay, you're nodding your head.
We have different writing styles, and so that was actually it could have been, it was a comedy, it could have been a tragedy, but I am what you call a plotter, and Elizabeth is a pantser. So she flies by the seat of her pants and she just gets into the story and goes, whereas I do outlines and I plan and I think. And so we had approached the research by dividing the subjects, and I took Janet Harmon Bragg and Cornelius Coffey, and Elizabeth took John C. Robinson and Willa Brown. And we went off into our corners and did all this research in the middle of a pandemic, which made it very difficult to get access. And then we came back and tried to compile what we had. And I kept thinking, Elizabeth is working so hard and doing such a great job, and I am just a lazy slob who can't get it together. Because I'm not used to working with a partner, and it's like showing somebody your house before you've cleaned it for the party. I was like, I don't want her to see my early drafts, but it turned out
I was thinking exactly the same thing. She didn't know it, but I was thinking exactly the same thing.
So we finally came together.
Because you're a pantser, and she's more of a planner, you probably thought that you were ruining her flow, and you as a planner thought you were ruining her flow.
No. I did not think she was ruining anything. We both had the impression that the other one was just like really, really into this and working much harder. And Sherri, I mean, I've completely forgotten about this, but what was your story about my reaction to your chapter outline?
Oh, so
Or no, to your timeline.
Yeah, I made this timeline, and I did turn it into a chapter outline, but I call it my murder wall because it was like the police have the big board up with all the suspects in a crime. I had this giant timeline that I taped up in my office, and my husband came in. He's like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "I'm writing a book. Leave me alone." But I finally shared it with Elizabeth, and I thought she was going to think I was cuckoo, and she was like, "This is amazing. Thank God you've done this."
It's like, God, I have no idea what the time was, what the order was, because the way
it all fits together.
The way I work, I sort of like I amass the stuff and then I just kind of like plow through it, and it falls into place in my head and in my writing as I'm going. But Sherri likes to line everything up ahead of time and work through it. And actually, our two different writing styles really kind of helped each other out, I think. I don't think we realized this until we finally both got together and like in person, and we're able to meet each other and talk to each other, because we'd had Zoom calls and we knew about each other. We sent masses of emails, but we hadn't actually met in person.
Oh, okay. So you all's worked writing styles complemented each other.
I think so. Yeah. And I think when you read the book, we know pretty much who wrote what or who started the ball rolling, but I don't think that you can really tell as you read it that it's written by two people. I think the style is its own style and is very readable just as it is.
We worked very hard with our editor, Stephanie Pitts, and we went back and forth a lot with, I did a draft and I passed it on and she rewrote it and passed it back, and we went back and forth. So the book does have its own voice.
That's awesome. So I guess it does take a really good editor to make sure that everything is seamless. So I'm not reading and then all of a sudden it starts to look a little different.
Yeah, and I think we also learned each other's style. I write nonfiction for younger kids, and so I'm like short, clear sentences, and Elizabeth is the PhD who likes a long
I like the
and meaningful
semicolons.
semicolon sentences. So you'll see there's a blend of both of those, but I definitely went through and took out semicolons, and she went through and combined my sentences.
See, I can see now that Elizabeth, you and I would get along well. I sometimes like longer sentences, but I like to combine sentences. So sometimes I'll take two shorter sentences, like we can put that together. But I guess it kind of depends though, maybe how do you want the flow of your paragraph or your narrative to be? Sometimes shorter sentences will help you to read a little bit faster, while the longer sentences kind of slow your pace down a little bit.
Yeah, and sometimes I felt like you needed a longer sentence to make the transition from one thought to the next. So like you had two short sentences that really didn't seem entirely connected, but if you combined them, you could kind of it helped with the transition. I don't know. I mean that's true in my own writing, you know.
That's true.
I'm not criticizing Sherri's writing.
Well, I would say conversely, the shorter sentences, you're right. If you want an action sequence or things are getting too academic or too informational, and you want a scene to really pop, then you go for the shorter, punchy sentences, especially because there's so many hilarious stories in this book of the adventures this group of pioneering Black aviators had, you know, airplane crashes. Things like that you want to be punchy, you know, or funny sequences. And so
like, you know, when Hubert Julian gets mad at John Robinson and approaches him in his hotel lobby waving newspaper articles that he wrote about him, and he's like, you did this, and they have a punch up, you know. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that you want to keep the action going. So
see, I hope everybody's listening, because this is a total masterclass on writing right now. I'm really enjoying this. I'm just listening to you go back and forth.
Yeah, well, especially collaboration, because it's not easy to write with another person. I've only done it once, and as far as published, and it was my daughter, so you know I had a little bit more control in that kind of situation. But I do want to ask that the four people that you feature, do they know each other?
Oh yeah.
Are they like in the same unit? Or they
absolutely. Okay. They interact with each other. I mean, there are falling out, you know, they don't all end up together.
We'll frame the story is that this young man, Cornelius Coffey, out of Arkansas through Omaha, Nebraska, he ends up in Chicago to learn to be an auto mechanic, and then in Detroit, where he meets another auto mechanic, John C. Robinson, and they, much like Elizabeth and me, did not think they were going to get along. And then they then realized that they both had a dream of flying, but no way of learning how to do it. So they both end up back in Chicago, and they, by hook or by crook, bully their way finally into a school that would not accept Black people, but by threat of lawsuit and by being incredibly smart and clever and talented and building their own airplane, they get into these classes, graduate at the top of their class, and do so well that the head of the school, who had rejected them originally, said, if you think there are other Black people who want to learn to fly, we'll let you teach that class. And so through the classes they taught, they then meet Janet Harmon Bragg, and eventually they meet Willa Brown, who also learns to fly from them. They have a fan club, a flying fan club, basically, that turns into a group of aviators.
Oh, okay. And eventually, when after Johnny Robinson goes to Ethiopia and he ends up sort of, you know, flying and for Haile Selassie and helping him with his very small air force. When he comes back is when things start to fall apart between him and Coffey, who had really started out as friends and collaborators. But at that point, Willa Brown kind of picks up where the management side of things, where Johnny leaves off. And between them, Coffee and Willa Brown end up running a flight school together and working for the civilian pilot training program during World War II, and training pilots who eventually become the Tuskegee Airmen, and helping to integrate the U.S. Air Force. So like it's almost a story of pay it forward. The people definitely all know each other. And way down the line, in the 1980s, people started actually recognizing some of their contributions and got them back together, the ones of them that were still alive.
So what is the time frame for the book? I mean, in terms of years, like, or decades.
So the
It
book
starts in what decade and ends in what
So
decade?
there's a prologue in 1919, because that is when Cornelius Coffey, as a teenager, took his first flight with a barnstormer who had been a World War I vet. But the story really picks up in 1927 and goes through 1948. And I should go back a little bit in aviation history and point out that before these guys were around, the first Black American flyers were a guy named Eugene Bullard, who fled to France when he was a teenager because he came from the South and wanted to escape Jim Crow. And when World War I started, he wanted to learn to fly and offered to fly for the United States in the war, and they wouldn't take him because he was Black. And the French welcomed him, and he became a French pilot and hero. And after him, there was Bessie Coleman, who'd been a hairdresser in Chicago, and she goes to France to learn to fly and becomes the first Black American woman, and she was part Native American woman to hold, and first American to hold an international pilot's license. So she had a dream of opening flight schools for people of color in the United States. She died before that could happen, but not before Cornelius Coffey and John C. Robinson learned about her and looked up to her. And so they actually flew memorial services over her grave every year. While they were a flying club together, they would drop flowers from an airplane onto her grave. So it is paying it forward. It was like Eugene and Bessie helped crack open the glass ceiling to the sky, and then more and more pilots of color started doing the same and making sure to leave it open for the next generation. Coffey went on to teach aviation mechanics in high school in Chicago, well into the 80s.
Wow,
Oh, okay, wow.
that's
Yeah.
quite a while.
That is.
Yeah. Yeah. He was the oldest. He was born first, and he lived the longest, and he
Yeah.
flew up until about a couple of years before he died in his 90s.
Oh, okay, boy. So what is depicted on the cover of the book? What is that a picture of?
So that is actually early on. So we're talking 1932. These guys decided that, and this was when Coffey and Johnny were still really working together. In fact, it was when they were both still teaching together at Aeronautical University. They decided that they wanted to have their own airfield. And they had been sharing airfields with white pilots in Chicago, and race relations were not running entirely smoothly, and they wanted an airfield of their own. And they ended up at Robbins, Illinois, which was incorporated as an all-Black township, and it had Black mayor and firemen, and they ran things themselves, and they rented land from them. And they basically, is in the middle of the Great Depression. They cleared the land themselves. They dug a boulder the size of a car out of the ground. They couldn't lift it. So eventually they dug a huge hole around it and just dropped it in and covered it up. And they built a hangar themselves. And what you see on the cover is the hangar that they built. Johnny Robinson drew up the blueprints for the hangar, and apparently they could only build it when he was around because nobody else could read his writing. But what you see is the aircraft, that they had 3 aircraft in there. One was actually belonged to one of the white pilots that they had flown with previously, and one belonged to Coffee, and one belonged to Janet, who had a good job as a nurse and was the financer of the group. So she had bought her own plane before she could fly. And
I love that. I love
I
that.
know,
She's
isn't
like
that cool?
this black woman with the best job of the group and the money and willing to put it into the things she dreams about. So if you look at that picture, you'll see the very dapper guy in the flight cap and trench coat at the end is Johnny. And Janet is leaning up against the plane all in white. And so that was their group. They were called the Brown Eagle Aero Club, but at this point they changed their name to the Challenger. The Challengers, which was named after one of the engines used in these early planes.
I think what interests me most is that, and if I'm hearing this correctly, these aren't just military aviators you're talking
Oh,
about.
not at all. This was so okay.
Yeah,
Let's go
so
back a little bit there.
Okay.
Black people were not allowed to fly in the military until towards the end of World War II. So the Tuskegee Airmen were originally called the Tuskegee Experiment because in
right.
1921, the United States military commissioned a study about the use of black man or Negro manpower, I believe it was called. And in it, they said that Black people were not smart enough or brave enough to be good soldiers. And they certainly didn't think they could fly. And so it was an uphill battle fought on many different fronts in order to allow African Americans to be trained as pilots in the United States and allow them to actually fly in the military. So there were lawsuits and lots of lobbying by Coffey's group and Tuskegee and other groups, first to get into the civilian pilot training program that prepared pilots in case we did enter World War II, and then to have some of those programs turned into military training programs, as Tuskegee finally was. And so these are the precursor to Blacks being in the military. And then it is only in 1948 that Harry S. Truman then desegregates the military.
That's an amazing point, and I'm very, very glad that you make it, because I think often when we think of Black aviators, we forget about the people who weren't in the military. We just automatically default to Tuskegee Airmen, and we're thankful for their contributions, but they weren't the only Black aviators. So that makes this book even more important, I feel.
And I feel like my husband said when he read the book, it sounds like there were a lot more people than these ones that you actually focused on. And it's true. There was a group of Black aviators in New York City. There was another group in Los Angeles. And presumably there were others flying throughout the USA. One of the things that these guys did was they nationalized their organization. They made a group called the National Aviators Association of America, and all the members were Black, and they had air meets where people would fly from all over the country to get together and share experiences and work on lobbying and have aviation competitions. So they really were networking with the other flyers throughout the USA. And this is in the late 1930s, and we aren't aware of them. They're all civilians.
I would go so far as to say, like, one of Coffey's things was integration. So in all of his classes in his school, he made sure there was at least one white person and one woman to prove to the military and to the US government that we could all learn together. And so while the membership of the NAAA was mostly Black, they chose not to put Negro in the name as they had thought of originally, because they didn't want to limit themselves. So some of these air shows were integrated air shows, some of the first integrated air shows. And I think that's really important, that there was this sense that the sky could be a new frontier where equality reigned. That's why the subtitle of our book is Chicago's Pioneering Black Aviators and the Race for Equality in the Sky, because you have a lot of people during the Great Migration coming to these city centers with dreams. And one of those was the dream of flight, really unified in a way by the big black newspapers of the time. The Chicago Defender was a huge proponent of race flyers, as they would call them. And so then you had this the Negro Associated Press sharing these stories all around the nation to really sort of uplift everyone. Our guys were key to that. But yeah, there's some other great stories out there still to be told.
Yeah.
Well, I hope that we continue to tell them, because this is what our history is all about. We can't keep learning about the same people over and over again.
Right. And I'm glad we're learning about with new people that are starting to get their due, that people who were doing really amazing, innovative things. One thing I wanted to add, and I don't have the exact information right in front of me because it just came to mind, but a lot of the early professional Black organizations that could not join the American, I think the American Medical Association was one of them. They used national in their name instead of American because they couldn't be a part of the white organization, but they wanted to not necessarily put Negro in their name, like you were talking about earlier. And several of them use national. The only one I can think of right now is the medical one, but there were some other ones as well. And I read about this years ago. I can't remember, it was years ago when I read about it, but yeah, a lot of things that we take for granted now, there were a lot of parallel organizations that we started ourselves because we could not be part of the white organizations, or what we call the big organizations. But that did not stop us from moving forward, organizing, and being our best.
Amen.
Absolutely right.
Well, ladies, unfortunately, we've come to the end of the half hour. But if you can remind us, please, how we can reach out to you, how we can find this wonderful book. I would tell you to show us the cover, but I already see it behind you.
It is. And somebody said lawyers too. I'm pretty sure there was a national lawyers organization because they couldn't join the American, whatever the one was, the other one. So anyway, this has been an amazing conversation, and congratulations to you two on a wonderful collaboration. Thank you, Elizabeth, for either staying up or getting up.
Kind of both.
And letting us meet you both. And I'm glad that you all wanted to come on together, because I originally reached out to Sherri, not realizing that it was a co-author book, because I think I saw an article about Sherri, and I pulled up the information, like the flyer about the book, and then that was great. But I'm glad that was wonderful.
Well, I owe it to her because she graciously said, well, you must have my co-author on as well.
Right. And I appreciate that very much. So thank you
for
both.
having us both. And you can, you know what, you can find us online. Our names are our website, and and we're both on Instagram. The book is American Wings, Chicago's Pioneering Aviators and the Race for Equality in the Sky. Thank you so much for having us on.
Okay,
Thank
thank
you
so
for
much.
being here. Best wishes on your book. I will be reading it. It sounds amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great one.